Today we continue in our sermon series where we have been going through the book of Romans, and we pick up today in the 5th chapter. We'll read verses 12 through 21. So I invite you there, Romans 5, 12 through 21. But we'll actually begin with the 13th verse. We're going to read the verses 13 through 17. And if you are taking notes or if you're writing in your Bible, what I'd like for you to do is to put a parenthesis around verses 13 through 17. This is really like a footnote that Paul puts into his larger argument. He wants us to understand what's in the parentheses, and when we understand 13 through 17, then we'll understand the larger argument as a whole. So we'll first try to understand what's in these parentheses, and then take that into the larger argument. What we'll see in this footnote, so to speak, of Paul's in 13 through 17 is that he describes for us the nature of sin. So we're pulling back the curtain and we're seeing the way that sin really works. We're looking at it under a microscope to see how it came to be and what it does, all its ins and outs. And then we also catch a glimpse of the cure as well. Let's read from Romans 5:13. Paul writes this: "Sin was indeed in the world before the law, but sin is not reckoned when there is no law." So, one of the things we know to be true is that sin is the breaking of God's law. It's breaking the rules. I mean, in its simplest terms, that's what sin is. It's breaking the rules that God's set down. But we know that it must be more than that, too, because here in this verse we see that even before there was law, even before there were written down rules for people to follow, we're told that there was sin in the world, even before there was law. So how can that be? Well, remember with me, back into chapter 1, where Paul makes this argument that God is knowable enough in nature, that there's sufficient evidence in the natural world around us and in our own bodies and our own minds that we should know better than to break the rules of God, even though the rules haven't been laid down. We should know better than to trespass the law, even though there is no law written yet. So from Adam until Moses, which is when the law comes in, there is no written down rules, and yet there is this transgression, this sin in the world, and Adam's the first one to do it. He's the first one to introduce sin to the human race. But here's it's an interesting thought, that because there's no law, though there may be sin, there's not necessarily a crime. There's not a legalistic reckoning against anyone of a crime that's been committed. Which is interesting, isn't it? I mean, in some sense, we're thinking, wow, that sounds kind of cool. You get to live in the world without any rules. No rules, right? Some of you guys are going to go back to school. What if you, on the first day of school, go into the class and the principals and the teachers say, we're going to try something new this year. This year, there's going to be no rules in the school. At first, all the kids would say, yeah, no rules. And it would be great. Until a bigger kid comes and takes your lunch. And then you go to the teacher and you say, that kid took my lunch. And they say, sorry, there's no rule against it. You see, rules are put in place for us, not to be adversarial to us, but to make life better for us. God gives us the law eventually, not to make our life hell, but to make it better. Because God loves us, He gives us the law. He shows us where the boundaries of creation are and writes those down in the form of the Ten Commandments and the Mosaic law that's given to the people of Israel. So even before law comes in, there is still sin, but without the law, we don't have the advantage of being able to recognize it. So we'll continue to read here. Verse 14, Paul continues. Yet death exercised dominion from Adam to Moses. Remember, that's the time period when there was no law, but there's still these consequences for sin. It may not be a law, but sin still has its consequence, and the consequence is death. So he says, death exercised dominion, even from Adam to Moses, even over those whose sins were not like the transgression of Adam, who is a type of the one to come. Sin is deadly. It's the original killer. Before sin came into the world, was no such thing as death. Now, knowing that, let me ask you this question. Knowing that reality, do you think it would be better to not have the law of God? Or are we thankful that we have it? Let me maybe help you think about this another way. If you had a kind of cancer that was treatable, would you want to know about it? Initially we say, yeah, of course we would. Of course we would want to know about if we had a cancer that was treatable. That's absolutely something we would want to be able to have knowledge of and deal with. And I know that that's the easy answer, and that's the way I would answer it. But let me push back just a second against it. Say, do you really want to know that you have that kind of cancer, even if it's treatable? Because guess what? The doctor's going to tell you need to stop smoking. Or the doctor's going to tell you that you need to stay out of the sunshine because it's killing you. See, the same way we look at the law, and we say, the reason we don't want it is because the law tells us things we don't like to hear. It tells us that we need to stop doing things that we're doing because it's killing us. Or we need to start doing things that we're not doing because it's killing us. The law becomes this diagnostician for the reality that we have a terminal disease in sin. The original killer. Now, there's this other question that I think is also important to address here. If I had a cancer that you could not treat, now maybe you would answer this differently. This is just me. But if I had a cancer that I was not able to treat, I would rather not know, I think. Maybe you'd say you would rather know, but I wouldn't. I wouldn't want to know. And I think that also translates spiritually. If I was a sinner and there was no hope for me, then I'd rather not have the law. If I'm going to die anyway and I'm spiritually doomed, I'd rather not know the ways in which I'm transgressing God. But here's the reality. There is a cure. And so it's important to have the law because there is a hope. Because death is not the final answer. There is life, and it's offered to us in Jesus Christ. Let's read here in verse 15. You'll begin to see what I mean. But the free gift is not like the trespass. For if the many died through one man's trespass, much more surely have the grace of God and the free gift of grace in the one man Jesus Christ abounded for the many. What's the plague? Sin. What's the epidemic? Sin is that plague. What's the cure? Grace. The free gift of grace in Jesus Christ. 16. And the free gift is not like the effect of one man's sin. For the judgment following one trespass brought condemnation, but the free gift following many trespasses brings justification. If because of one man's trespass, death exercised dominion through that one, much more surely those who receive the abundance of grace and the free gift of righteousness exercise dominion in life through the one man, Jesus Christ. So here's how grace and sin are similar. They are both of them are introduced to humanity through one person, respectively. Sin is introduced to the world through Adam, and grace is introduced to the world through Jesus Christ. But here's how sin and grace are different. Sin is something that we do. Sin is something that we do, and it's limited, it's finite. But grace is something that's done for us, and it is unlimited. It is infinite. So here's the three things that Paul wants us to know about in this footnote, this parentheses. It's kind of a big footnote here, isn't it? But here's what he wants us to know, to take into the larger argument. First, that law makes us aware of our sin. Second, that sin is in its very nature bringing death. That sin brings death. It's the natural consequence of sin, that we die. And third, that Adam, remember Adam and Eve, the story that Peggy read, Adam is the source of sin. That is, he introduced it. He is, for those of you who like the zombie movies, he's patient zero. He's the initial one. And Christ can take that into the beginning of verse 12. Now, I'll read verse 12 and I'm going to go right into 18. I believe that they are intended to be read together, and everything in between is just kind of that parentheses or that footnote that Paul intends for us. So I'm going to read 12 and then go right into 18. Therefore, Paul writes, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death came through sin, and so death spread to all because all have sinned. Therefore, just as one man's trespass led to condemnation for all, so one man's act of righteousness leads to justification and life for all. For those of you who don't know who Martin Luther is, Martin Luther was a theologian in the 1500s, a very important theologian. He started the Reformation. He is the one that caused the church to break away from the unfaithfulness of the Catholic Church. And there were a lot of different issues that were at stake. One of them was the sacraments. It was baptism in particular. In the 1500s, the Catholics had a very pastoral concern, and Martin Luther did too, but he thought theology was important as well. And the concern is this, that the infant mortality rate in the 1500s was significantly higher than it is now, obviously. Babies died much more regularly when they were born. And so the Catholic answer to that, from a spiritual point of view, is, well, let's get those babies baptized immediately. It was a great concern because they believed that the salvation of that baby was tied to the event of baptism, that baptism was what saved them. Well, Martin Luther said that's not right. He said that's not what we read in the Bible. We know that the grace of Jesus Christ is what saves them, not baptism. So Luther had to do some going back to the Scriptures, some explaining what it means. And it's interesting as Luther comments on these verses that we've read here, that he does a great deal of theology. He spends a great deal of time trying to distinguish between original sin and actual sin. Now, as Luther puts it, original sin is that sin that we inherit from Adam, that you can't get away from. It's what's given to you initially from Adam, and actual sin is the sin that you actually commit yourself. And so he wants to spend a great deal of time differentiating between those, I think largely because he's facing this pastoral issue of what do we do with babies. He mentions babies a lot as he's speaking about these verses because he wants to have an answer for that. And his answer is to distinguish between original sin and actual sin. Now, I think Luther does well to move us away from the Catholic understanding, but I think Luther is really responding more to the world in his answer here than he is to the Word. Because the Word teaches us something very different. That there's not really a distinction between original sin and actual sin. Let me show you. If you look at the last part of verse 18, it says this, that death spread to all because all have sinned. And in the Greek it reads like this. The Greek word is pho. It's a transition word for because, but it actually translates a little bit differently than just because. It translates like this: death spread to all inasmuch as all have sinned. In other words, your personal death is a result of your personal sin. You see, Luther's theory is that a baby would not go to hell because the baby didn't have any actual sin. All it had was original sin. And so, there's not any actual sin piled onto that baby. Well, why, Luther? Why would you say that? Why do we tend to say that babies are sinless? Well, because we say they haven't broken any rules yet, right? They're born into the world, they haven't broken any laws, they haven't broken any rules.